Mr. President, it has been a tumultuous year in Iran, to put it mildly. The Iranian regime has continued to pursue its nuclear ambitions, fund terrorist activities throughout the Middle East, and repress its own people, as we saw in the wake of this summer's illegitimate elections, where brave and peaceful protesters were violently attacked. If Iran were to acquire nuclear weapon capabilities, it would pose a significant threat to the peace and security in the Middle East, close ally in the State of Israel, not to mention others in the region, as well as to ourselves. For years, the Iranian regime has refused reasonable requests by the international community and failed to meet its obligations under international non-proliferation rules. President Obama has undertaken a very aggressive dual-track approach, and I commend him for it, offering high-level engagement with Tehran matched with sustained pressure through economic sanctions and a warning that Iran will not be allowed to run out the clock. As chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, I intend to introduce legislation, Mr. President, to arm this administration with the ability to impose tough, targeted sanctions if the Iranian government does not respond to the administration's final diplomatic effort in the coming weeks. We must confront Iran's government about its long record of duplicity and deception on its nuclear facilities. Last week, President Obama revealed that Iran is building a secret uranium enrichment facility in violation of international rules. The President and our allies have rightly insisted on prompt access to the IAEA inspectors to this facility. And over the weekend, Iran moved forward on provocative missile tests. In 2 days, the United States and our allies will begin key talks with Iran's leaders. Unfortunately, Mr. President, Iran's president has already suggested that appropriate limits to his country's nuclear enrichment program are off the table. Strong international rejection of election abuses, renewed support of our allies, and tensions within the Iranian regime, now breaking into open, all offer reasons for hope that Iran might be forced to change course. But it will be hard, to put it mildly, difficult, to put it mildly. It will require sustained diplomatic efforts to ensure that all of our strategic partners, the Europeans, the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, and modern Arab states throughout the Middle East, join in this effort. We will only succeed if Iran is confronted by the prospect of sustained, progressively intensifying, multilateral economic and diplomatic pressure on its government, including tougher sanctions. This week's negotiations should confront Iran's leaders with a clear choice: end illegitimate efforts to enrich uranium, halt proliferation efforts, and stop support for terrorists around the world, or continue to deepen Iran's isolation and ruin its economy. I support the administration's efforts to engage Iran while making clear that biting sanctions will follow if they continue to refuse to meet the demands of the international community for greater transparency. Administration officials have outlined to me a menu of additional tough multilateral sanctions that they're considering imposing and are working to broaden support among our allies. Congress must equip the President with a full range of tools to deal with the threats passed by Iran. In the last Congress, the Banking Committee, which I chair, approved comprehensive legislation to improve tough new sanctions on the government of Iran, authorizing investors to divest from companies active in Iran's energy sector and to combat black market networks spreading weapons around the world. Unfortunately, floor consideration in this body was repeatedly blocked by a small minority of this chamber. Given the rising stakes, I intend to work with my committee colleagues, Ranking Member Senator Shelby of Alabama, to press forward similar sanctions legislation in the next few weeks. I want to congratulate my colleague from Connecticut, Senator Lieberman, and Senator Bayh of Indiana, among others, for their leadership on this issue as well, including their legislation to impose even further sanctions on entities involved in importing gasoline to Iran or insisting Iran's efforts to expand its domestic refining capacity. Iran's energy sector is a key source of revenue to the government, and Iran is especially susceptible because of its dependence on imported gasoline. And so I will integrate these critical provisions into the legislation I'll be offering in the next few days. Our legislation will be targeted and strategic, maximizing the economic leverage of the United States and our partners and allies and investors, while avoiding the risks of a more indiscriminate approach. The bill would also expand coverage under the Iran Sanctions Act to include financial institutions, underwriters, guarantors, and other business entities, and extend the applicability of sanctions to oil and gas pipelines and tankers. It would impose a broad ban on imports directly from Iran to the United States and exports from the United States to Iran of those few items that they're still able to be shipped while exempting food and medicines. It for a freezing of assets of Iranians active in weapons and proliferation or terrorist activity, and make clear that the United States entities who establish a subsidiary to get around U.S. sanction laws will be held liable for the activities of their subsidiaries. Finally, Mr. President, what we will be proposing imposes new requirements that the President actually make a determination and report every 6 months to Congress regarding this sanctionability of eligible investments in Iran's energy sector. Mr. President, in addition to expanding U.S. sanctions, the legislation that I'll be writing would also provide a simple formula authorizing divestment from firms which invest significant amounts in Iran's energy sector, with provisions patterned after the Sudan Accountability and Divestment Act enacted 2 years ago. Many of us believe, Mr. President, that Americans should be able to divest from energy firms doing business with the Iranian regime, whose policies they abhor, and which indirectly help to prop up that regime. They should be given the tools they need to make socially responsible decisions, and investors who choose to divest states, large pension and mutual funds, and others should be held harmless for these decisions. Investing in Iran is risky business, and investors should be fully informed of those risks going in. The legislation we'll be writing does not require divestment, it simply permits it. Finally, this bill would provide incentives for countries to strengthen their export control systems, to stop the illegal diversion of sensitive dual-use technology to countries like Iran, and impose tough new licensing requirements on those who refuse to cooperate. As we confront the realities of a global marketplace, with manufacturers assembling parts of complex machinery, such as aircraft and computers, from a supply chain spanning the globe, and as regimes like Iran and North Korea and Syria trawl various transshipment hubs for such parts to assemble high-tech weapons, it makes sense, in my view, to address this problem head-on. We have developed a way to do this with an array of carrots and sticks to prod unwilling countries to get serious about developing and implementing tough, comprehensive export control rules and systems. Our European and other allies continue to work closely with the United States to increase economic and diplomatic pressure on Iran. I believe our legislation will complement and reinforce those ongoing diplomatic efforts and send a very clear signal, Mr. President, to Iran's government of what's in store if they choose to continue to flaunt the will of the international community. Congress will be moving forward on the same timetable that the President and our allies have set for this fall, to underscore to Iran's leaders the huge price they will pay, economically, politically, diplomatically, and otherwise, if they do not change course. Mr. President, the government of Iran must come to clean on its nuclear program, which, as President Obama observed last week, represents a direct challenge to the basic foundation of the international non-proliferation regime. I would hope that my colleagues would join us in supporting these efforts in the coming weeks to make clear to the Iranians that we in the United States Congress, Democrats and Republicans alike, will stand with the President of the United States in our common determination to confront this problem forcefully and urgently before it is too late. Mr. President, we'll have our hearing on October 6th of the Banking Committee, and my intention is that shortly thereafter, a week or so thereafter, to combine the various proposals that have been authored, as I mentioned earlier, into one very strong, comprehensive sanctions bill. I, like many others, believe we should take no options off the table, and that we understand the implications of that statement. But I think most of us agree, at least I hope we do, that every effort ought to be made to resolve this matter short of the use of military force. But obviously that option remains out there. But I believe what we're proposing here is a sanctions regime, along with the needed cooperation, of other nations around the world, will send that unequivocal message. Nothing would be more important at this hour than to send that clear, united message from this body and the other of our determination to use all the tools available to us, short of that military use, to bring about the desired change we seek. But if that should fail, those other options remain. My hope is we would never have to get there. And by adopting this strong legislation, my hope would be that they would understand how serious we are in our determination to achieve the common goal being sought by this administration and all of us in this body. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.